Senator Hagerty of Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Chair Gensler. In your prepared testimony, you referenced novel authorities that granted to the SEC by Dodd-Frank, as you claim, and I'd like to start my comments by briefly addressing some of those before I get into the questions. In several of the recent proposed rules that have been put forth by the SEC, notably the private fund advisors and the predictive data analytics rules, your claimed authority is based on what I view as a very tortured interpretation of Section 913 of Dodd-Frank. As you know, the Supreme Court has recently said that major regulations require clear congressional authorization. Yet Section 913G, the provision that you rely most heavily upon, provides very limited authority to regulate in this space, not blanket authority for the SEC to ignore all the other binding language of the law and completely rewrite the standard of care for broker-dealers and for investment advisors. If Congress really wanted to grant unlimited authority to the SEC, do you think it would have put such an expansive power in a subsection titled Other Matters and buried it in a provision that discussed standards for providing personalized investment advice to retail investors? That's clearly not the case. Basically, any law can be distorted by reading a single section in isolation. For example, in the predictive data analytics rule, the SEC defines a conflict of interest as any interest of the firm. In addition to adhering to an overly literal reading of the law, you also conveniently ignore its clear limitations, which are obviously intended to confine the SEC's authority to, quote, certain sales practices and conflicts. What appears to be happening is that you're targeting a subset of the industry that's despised by the left. By applying a different standard for emerging tech, the SEC is not acting as a neutral party. Indeed, the SEC seems to be targeting many of the newer entrants that are actually expanding Americans' access to investments. In the case of the private funds rule, the SEC already has ample enforcement authority to recover funds on behalf of investors. So there must be another purpose for this rule. What you appear to be doing here is trying to change the negotiating dynamics between two sophisticated parties in favor of one over the other, a clear abuse of power. One of these problems with such an ideological-driven agenda is that important matters that are critical to the SEC's missions fall through the cracks as you waste resources on matters like this. So let's get to a matter where the SEC really should be focused upon, and that's Chinese government-connected broker-dealers. Recent congressional oversight letters and press reports have highlighted the growing trend of broker-dealers with connections to the Chinese government. These Chinese-linked firms are operating retail businesses in the U.S., including Webull, Moomoo, Prometheum, and Tiger Securities. Some of these companies, like Webull, even have registered representatives located in China. As you know, Chinese law is far different from U.S. law. They don't play by the same set of rules. So my question is, how can the SEC and FINRA actually oversee registered representatives and employees of these firms who are located in China? And why should these firms be allowed to register and do business with retail customers in the United States?
You raise a good question. And regardless of brokers' location, whether in China, whether in Europe, anywhere, they want to be in our markets, they've got to participate and play by our rules. Absolutely. And they have to be subject to them and subject to examination and have openness to that. And
well, how do you examine and impose the rules on these guys located in China?
Having gone through a lot of challenging negotiations with the Chinese authorities over a separate matter around auditing and inspecting auditors, I share your concern because it is quite a challenge. But we successfully, with Congress's help on something called the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, we got the leverage. Congress gave us additional leverage, and we were able to be successful there. And we've actually been able to, through the PCAOB, the auditing board, to inspect those auditors.
Well, I would encourage this allocation of resources to really focus on these sort of actors. I'd like to turn to another point. Last month, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia unanimously ruled that the SEC's denial of Grayscale's spot Bitcoin ETF was, quote, arbitrary and capricious. They argued that the product is mathematically indistinguishable from already approved futures products currently trading on U.S. exchanges. So my question is, can you explain what the SEC needs to see in a filing to approve a spot Bitcoin ETF? And what questions do you still need answered from issuers about the market and/or market infrastructure in order to allow this to happen? I'd just like to get some clarity.
Be very brief, and we're moving on. Chair Gensler.
Senator, I thank you for the question. We're still reviewing that decision and reviewing. We have multiple filings around Bitcoin exchange-traded products, so it's not just that one you mentioned, but it's multiple others who are reviewing them, and I'm looking forward to staff's recommendations. So, in similar questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Warren of Massachusetts.